Hi, this is Kyle again with another video in the Getting Started series that will cram in there somewhere. And this one's on the subject of style guides. I mentioned somewhere in the last couple of videos something about PEP8 referring to a style guide. Well, now we're going to talk about what that is. Like with any form of writing, it's possible to have good code or bad code. And also, like most forms of writing, programmers use style guides. So programmers use style guides, but it does exist in many forms of writing. And what you'll find is people who write for a specific blog, for example, write certain things and reference things in certain ways. Wikipedia has a huge style guide for how things are linked and how things are referenced. Newspapers write things in ways that are meant to remove bias and report more accurately. And then realtors do that really strange thing where they put an uppercase letter at the start of every single word. I don't know why that is, but like almost all forms of writing, whether you realize it or not, there are style guides to make things match and look good. Using a style guide makes things more consistent, easier to read, and easier to maintain. And applies in all forms of writing, but you see it in code as well. So who's a style guide for? Well, I've talked about several industries where we use them, but when you're using a style guide for code, I need you to just make sure you're not thinking, I am just using a style guide for myself, or I am just using a style guide to get the marks. We need to break that line of thinking. We need you to use a style guide in the interest of supervisors, team members, yourself in the future rereading your old code, or possibly even your replacement, which could mean you got promoted, or it could mean you were hit by a bus. Hopefully you got promoted. So when our code is consistent and easy to read, it makes things better for all of these people. And when your supervisor, for example, is not a technically inclined person, this allows them to understand the work you're doing, and sometimes this can be a big asset in your career. So which style guide do we use? We're writing Python code, and so the style guides do vary a little bit based on what kind of code you're using often, not all the time. But different coding style guides are widely adopted at different tech firms. So Microsoft has their own, Google has their own, Apple has their own, and so on. The style guide you're going to use in your Durham College program may actually be different for every course and dependent on the programming languages used. So for web development stuff, you'll be using style guides based around web development and using the languages you're using for it. But since we're using Python, we're going to use what's been proposed by the Python Software Foundation, which is PEP8, the style guide for Python code. And it's available online at python.org at that link. If you search PEP8 on Google, you'll arrive there also. So that's the Python style guide we're going to use. There are other Python style guides. Most notably, there's a widely used Google standard for Python, and it's slightly different, but we're going to use the one that's for general Python, widely adopted by organizations outside of Google. The style guide is pretty big, especially when you're new to using a style guide. So here are a few highlights. There's a section about code layout, and it says to use spaces instead of tabs. When I was writing code in the documentation video, for example, I talked about using tabs that were set to 4 spaces, and that's a default in most Python editors. And it's pretty common in many programming languages. And what that means is when you press the tab key, it adds a number of spaces that rounds up to the next increment of 4 spaces. So rather than inserting a tab character, it inserts a series of spaces. So what it means is you'll be using your tab key a lot for indenting, and that should add the spaces you need, which is great. Any imports we use should be happening at the top of a code file on separate lines. There's some information in there about comments, and so we had a whole video about documentation earlier. I'm not going to repeat that. And there's a lot about naming conventions. They recommend using variables and functions named using lowercase. And you can use lowercase where words are joined, or you can separate them with underscores if you feel it helps with readability. So I tend to use the underscores. If you choose not to, that's your choice as long as your code is nice and readable. If you are using a variable value as a constant, those should be named using uppercase. Uppercase is when every letter in every word is an uppercase letter, and you still separate it using an underscore. Classes are named using cap words, which is each word in the name of the class has a capital on it. That's also called Pascal case, which I tend to use for file names. You'll see me using that for file names. Though it isn't in PEP8, because we're learning to be good programmers, we're going to generally recommend as instructors in this course that you name things descriptively and using actual words without abbreviation unless there's a good reason why not. Some abbreviations are fine. I tend to tolerate things like min and max because we all kind of know what those mean. But there are other times when people use variable names like p. I don't know what p is. And so I tend to like to avoid those things where the meaning of the variable isn't there. When it's a variable name that you would have to explain to someone if they asked, it's already not a good variable name. Name things what they are. So, how do you actually use the style guide? Well, generally, you may not even need to go to it if you closely follow the style-related coding practices you see in the video lectures and in any demos that you're shown. You can also review and consider bookmarking the PEP8 style guide. It's maybe a good idea, as you hand in each significant lab assignment, compare your naming conventions and documentation against the style guide just to make sure you haven't been making any mistakes. I can also tell you, for Atom and for Visual Studio Code, there are packages available that are designed to auto-check your style. Auto PEP8 is one of them. So you may want to look those up and you may want to look into implementing them. Here are a few questions about style guides that I've anticipated. So many organizations have coding style guides. Which is best? Well, the answer to that is whichever one you are paid to use. There is no best style guide. Some of you may come to assume that one is the best. You may have one you prefer when you become an experienced programmer. But really that doesn't matter, because if your boss or your organization tells you to use one, that's the one you're going to use. So let's not worry about which one is best. And if style guides are all different, and if none are best, why are we in this program actually enforcing adherence to a specific style guide? Well, we're doing that just because we want you to get used to it using a style guide. This is a normal practice in industry. Even if it's not our precise style guide, you are very likely to eventually need to work with a style guide, whether you like it or not. So we're getting you used to that practice. And it's not a terribly hard thing to do. I don't think this is demanding. How about people who say, who cares about coding style as long as the code works? Well, that's kind of the same as reading someone who wrote broken English that was really hard to read. You could still understand what they were saying, but it was hard to read, and maybe you got a certain impression of that person. How did that person come across? Well, that's the same thing that happens in your code. If your code looks like you don't know what you're doing, it might mean you don't know what you're doing, and people will tend to think that way. And we don't want that. We would like you to appear as a professional programmer when you exit this program, and that's what we're working toward here. So style guides are important to programmers for many reasons. We've talked about those, and we use the PEP style guide for Python code in this course. And if you would like to check what you should know at this point, maybe you can state a reason why style guides are important to programmers and why you should use the PEP8 style guide for Python code. You could answer that question by saying, you told me to, but maybe you can come up with a better reason as well.